So good morning, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Welcome
Good morning,
to
everybody.
IEP webinar on more effective use of learning assessment data. How can we get there, in fact? My name is Stephanie Late, and I am a program specialist in the Training and Education Program Unit here at IEP UNESCO, based in Paris, France. Today's 90-minute webinar is part of the series of webinars organized for the online specialized course on using learning assessment data to monitor SDG 4 progress. In fact, this course, which I am the coordinator, starts in March over 8 weeks, attending by 38 participants from 18 countries. So I take this opportunity to greet them. I've seen some names. They are there with us. And during this course aims to measure things. One, to evaluate the feasibility, the reliability, and the validity of large-scale national, regional, and international assessment studies. So with the participants, we look at the different kind of assessment studies that are very important to measure the learning outcomes. And we also reflect on the use of this data produced by those international or regional assessment studies, on the use of this data and the possible obstacle factors that may affect whether or not such data is used to guide policy for planning purposes. So this is the aim of the objective of the webinar today. And that's why we have decided to open this webinar to the IEP audience. So I have invited Eva Rodonite, to present the recent results of the IEP research program in this thematic area about the kind of factors that may affect the use or not the use of the data in the planning cycles. But before giving the floor to Eva, there will be Beatrice Bont, our global training practice lead, who will give us a welcome message. Beatrice?
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you, Eva. Thanks all of you for registering for our webinar. We welcome you today. We're very excited to have so many people today joining from so many places around the world. It's truly a global webinar. We've had many registrations from all over the world, north, south, east, and west. So we really welcome this opportunity. The topic of learning assessment data for measuring SDG 4 progress attracts many in light of the learning crisis. And the aim is to have an understanding of the outcomes and results of our education systems. How do we measure what students are learning? Whether they are learning? This is a key question for us because we develop capacity for education planners. And for them, this is at the heart of what they need to be doing when they support their education systems. So we want them to be able to understand student learning at a local, regional, national, and also at an international level. So we at IIEP can support improvement for education for children worldwide. More broadly, this open webinar today is part of our IIEP UNESCO training offer for education planners and policymakers worldwide. For us, the main objective is to develop the capacities of education policy and planners internationally. For this purpose, we have many different courses. Today's is one of them. It's an open webinar, which is part of a course that Stephanie was presenting to us. And we have many courses that are focused on developing skills for people working in ministries, but also other education stakeholders in donor agencies or in NGOs, even UNESCO field offices, UNICEF, World Bank, or other international organizations. And the focus is to make sure that those involved in education planning and policy development have the skills to do so. And so for that, we have courses online, in person, and hybrid. And as an example, the course today, but we also have other courses, for example, in crisis-sensitive planning. We have a program that will be starting in September on foundations of education sector planning, or many other courses. Now, it's a very exciting time for us because we are developing a new global learning academy that will be launched next year. And the idea is that we'll bring together the training that we offer across our different offices internationally. We have 3 offices, one in Buenos Aires, one in Dakar, one in Paris, and we're going to offer a training in a modular format. So learners, it could be you in the future, will be able to take different courses, stack them, and obtain an IIP diploma. So stay tuned because we will have more information in the future towards middle or end of this year. Now, for us, at the heart of our training is a focus on people. While we deliver training online and we're always innovating on how we teach using technologies, the heart of our training remains the people. It remains our training and support staff. This is what makes us stand out in our e-learning approach and in our regular learning in person as well. We really engage with our learners. We follow our participants to make sure they're learning, progressing, and they can finish. And as an example, in our most recent 9-month course on education sector planning, we had a group of learners up to 40. Only one person dropped out at the beginning, and 95% successfully completed after 9 months online. So we consider that as a success, as well as them being able to use what they're learning in their everyday environment. So we're really training professionals in education planning. So without further ado, I really thank you for joining us. We really look forward to the webinar today, to Yeva's presentation, and to really offering you many more opportunities for training in the future. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Béatrice. Je vais dire quelques mots en français.
Thank you. I'm just going to say a few words in French. This webinar, this global webinar, as Beatrice said, is actually recorded and can be made available to the audience. There's going to be a French and an English version. So I'm going to introduce Eva to you, who is a former IEP colleague, who is a researcher with UNICEF at the World Center of Research and Perspective. She is part of the research program Data Must Speak on the positive model. Now, previously, you worked at IEP for 6 years. We were on the same floor, I hope I'm not making mistakes. She focuses on learnings and teaching. She also coordinated a very important program on use of learning assessment data, and she also contributed to the learning portal. Now, all this information will be put on the chat. So I'm really happy to welcome Eva, because this is an important moment. It's the launch of a publication that brings together the resume of her research, or qualitative research in 6 sub-Saharan African countries. And I'm not going to unveil everything. Eva is going to say a few things herself. It's about how we can use data coming from large-scale evaluations. It's not about just collecting good data and have good data, but one must also use them properly for planning. And this is where Eva's research is extremely important and very relevant today, because we basically are going to look at all factors that are an impediment to the use of data. And I'm sure that what's reflected in research and what I've read is, yes, this is research carried out in Sub-Saharan Africa, but it's actually of relevance to all of us. I am Portuguese, and I actually connect, and this research strikes a chord with me as well. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. Do not use the chat. And after Eva's presentation, that's going to be very interactive, because there's going to be some surveys. There's going to be a special Q&A session. I'm going to select questions that you will ask in the Q&A. Eva, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm really happy to be here today and to share with you the IEP's research work on the use of learning assessment data. And as Stephanie has mentioned, it is an important month for this research program because its comparative analysis publication has just been released in French. And so this officially finalizes a full set of publications coming out of this research project. So it's definitely a good time to look back at the main results. So let me now share my screen with the presentation. So, okay, can everyone see my screen? Is it fine? Perfect. Yes, so in today's presentation, we'll first of all look at why it is so inherently difficult to study and to research the use of learning data. Then I will tell you more about this IIEP UNESCO study. And after that, we'll dive directly into the heart of the subject, and we will analyze a number of factors that affect the use of learning data. So we'll now move into the next slide and start with what does it mean to use data more generally. So the definition that we used in this research project emphasized that use of learning data refers to the process by which policymakers and planners actively consider, analyze, and engage with these data when conducting planning activities and developing policies. So you can see that it includes, but is not limited to making decisions in line with assessment findings. And so already from this definition, you can see why it is so difficult to study this process, because there are so many ways in which different actors can engage with data. And that's, at the end of the day, quite a personal experience that it's quite difficult to analyze at a higher level. So right from the literature review phase, in addition to this, we've also noticed that there has been very often quite a linear understanding of the use of data. And so now here, I move to the next slide. So we've very often seen this narrative that as long as countries participate in large-scale assessments and there is reliable and good quality data that is available on students' achievement, there are very high chances that governments and actors will actively consider, analyze, and engage with these data and even make decisions based on that. And so we wanted to question these processes because we've seen already in the literature that there are so many things that really disrupt this pathway and come into play. And if we only focus on the availability of data, so very often we stay at this stage. We really put attention on the reliability and validity of data, which are, of course, very important. But then the other elements that intervene in the use of data are sometimes overlooked. So, well, first of all, even the reasons of why countries join large-scale assessments sometimes do not include the willingness to use that data for decision making. There can be all sorts of other reasons to participate in those assessments. And policymaking and planning are also very complex and non-linear processes. And how data fits into that is definitely very complex. So we wanted to study all of these elements, and this is why we created IEP's research program on the use of learning assessment data that was implemented in 6 sub-Saharan African countries. And we looked at the use of national, regional, and international large-scale assessments, as well as EGRA, EGMA, and citizen-led assessments. So you can see that we have not specifically looked at the use of examination results, but we analyzed how examination results may interact with these other assessments. So the overarching goal of this study was to understand how to sustainably improve the use of learning data, because there has been an increasing number of it available worldwide. And we also wanted to raise awareness about the complex dynamics that are involved and that sometimes may be overlooked in the literature. More specifically, we wanted to look at the existing regulatory framework on the assessment data and how countries envisioned and imagined their assessment systems and what goals they had for that system. Then we wanted to see more specifically how countries use learning assessment data in different phases of the planning cycle. And then finally, what factors lead to the observed use of learning data. And so today our focus is on this third research question specifically. So let us now move into the next slide. Yes, and very briefly, just to set the context again, this study wanted to understand how countries use learning data across the planning cycle. And it was important because IEP works a lot around these different phases, and this has become a prominent sequence of processes in many countries. Throughout the research, it expanded also to more general policymaking, which is important to mention. And although we are not going to analyze in depth these elements today, but just very briefly to say that the research showed that learning assessment data are not used to their full potential across the different phases, and that some phases are more informed than others, as for instance, education sector analysis and monitoring and evaluation. But if you want to know more about these different aspects, I invite you to read the comparative synthesis publication that really presents all of these elements in depth. So next to it, we looked at a very long list of factors that may affect the use of learning data. Some of them that we plan to explore right from the beginning, and some others that emerge throughout the way. And today, we'll focus on 4 specific groups of these factors. And again, other factors are also analyzed in different IEP publications. So we'll look today at assessment policies, at technical capacities to produce and use data, at dissemination, and finally at the political economy of actors that was really at the heart of this research study. So let us start with assessment policies. So at the time that we conducted this research, and it's important to mention that data was collected between 2018 and 2020, and so some things may have changed in the meantime. But what we've seen is that very often countries did not have assessment policy in place. Well, actually, 4 out of 6 countries that participated did not have an assessment policy in place, although all of them were planning to develop them in the upcoming future. And the other thing that we've seen is that there were often quite a number of assessments that were not always very coherently articulated with one another. And we were trying to see the link between the two. So one of the explanations that was suggested by one of the research participants was that, well, many of these assessments were actually introduced as external projects. And so this is why there was no assessment policy. But consequently, it has become more difficult to develop such a policy once those assessments were already in place. And the literature, but also our research, demonstrated that assessment policies have indeed a strong potential to improve assessment systems and the use of their data, especially by providing this strategic vision for assessment systems, and also make it more clearly what the system is actually trying to achieve. So in this research project, we also had 2 countries that developed a successful assessment policies, and these were a good positive example for us to further explore what elements are important for a successful assessment policy. So first of all, we've seen that the process of developing it really needs to be inclusive and consider different actors, because it's a good moment to raise awareness, to get people curious about it, but also to have different people's insights into this policy. We've also seen that the dissemination of the policy, of course, is very then important for its implementation. For instance, in Zambia, the National Learning Assessment Framework was developed, but it was not widely disseminated, which to a certain extent hindered its implementation. And finally, we've seen that both countries, Zambia and the Gambia, made sure to align their policies with other key regulatory frameworks, especially the ones that link to curriculum and teacher policy, and also to wider education strategy, which was definitely very successful and helped situate assessment policies in a broader education framework. So let us now have a very quick polling question, and let's hear from you about assessment policies in your countries, and let's see whether this echoes our results or maybe not necessarily. So I will now give the floor to Amaranta, who will guide us through this polling process.
Merci beaucoup, Yeva.
Thank you, Eva. Right, so we're going to now move on to Meetup. Just sent you the instructions on the chat, and I'm going to share my screen so that you can see what we're going to do immediately. Right, I hope you can see my screen properly. I'm going to give you the instructions so that you can connect. Right, so all you need to do is go to menteecom and enter the code 3825 1427. I'm going to repeat it. Go to menteecom and enter the code 3825 1427. Otherwise, you can also scan the QR code with your mobile phone. I'm just going to leave the instructions for some time so that you can connect yourself. And you've got all the instructions in the chat. Please go to menteecom and enter the code 38251427. If you have a question, please don't hesitate to contact us on the chat if you're unable to connect to menteecom. Now I'm going to move on to the first question.
Dispose-t-il d'une politique d'évaluation?
Does your country have an assessment policy? And there are reactions and answers. 74 people have responded to this question. I'm just going to leave it on for another few seconds. Right, 90 people have answered for the moment. Most of them have said yes.
Très bien.
Right.
Je sais pas, Eva, si tu veux commencer à dire quelque chose par rapport
Eva, would you like to say something with regards to the answers that are being displayed?
Yes, thank you so much, Amaranta. And I definitely think that this is a very encouraging trend. And it's also the trend that probably does not surprise me that much because, yes, as I've mentioned, even in countries that did not have an assessment policy at the time, there was a very clear intention and willingness to develop it in the near future. So I think that definitely is reflected also in your responses. So I think it's really great to know that this regulatory framework is becoming stronger and stronger in so many countries. Yes, so I think that we can probably close this first poll. Thank you so much for all of your responses. It's really interesting. Yes, so let us now go back to the presentation. Yes, so another aspect that we analyzed in this research study, and I would say that this is probably the most important factor that affects the use of learning data, is the technical capacities that are available at the national level. So we've seen very clearly that when learning assessments are introduced in countries with low national technical capacities and without a supportive institutional framework, there are very high chances that there will be difficulties for national education systems to produce and use data. So we've seen that some countries developed very strong national assessment teams. That was the case, for instance, Senegal and the Gambia, and those strong teams really led the development and the production of the learning data and also encouraged the use. However, we've seen that in other countries, there were still quite some challenges in this area. And another almost a general finding was that capacities to produce and use this data were much lower every time at the decentralized level. So this is where support was more needed. So this research study also illustrated that different skills are needed to produce and use data. So for data production, we often need strong statistical skills and knowledge and sampling procedures. Whereas in order to use data, we're really referring here to skills for data interpretation and making this linkage with data and the policy making. So these are two different sets of skills, and we've seen that very often these skills to use the data are more often overlooked and that they require much more support. Another interesting element was that different actors underlined the lack of guidance to actually use that data. Many actors, and even at decentralized level, mentioned that they understand the value of this data, they understand how important it is, but that they need very specific and practical guidance. Okay, how can I actually use it in my everyday activities and in my everyday work? So that was definitely an important aspect. So a number of reoccurring needs were flagged during this research project, specifically when it comes to more advanced statistical skills and statistical analysis, but also, as I've mentioned, data interpretation and translation of findings into policy recommendations. Another important finding that links to capacities is that assessment teams that are really the nuclear of assessment systems in countries, very often they suffer from high turnover rates, meaning that people that are trained or that gain important skills very often leave those teams, as those skills are also needed in other areas. And the situation becomes even more difficult because the pool of professionals for these specific tasks is very often quite limited. So this sometimes leads, and quite often actually leads, to the situations where a very small amount of people in assessment teams end up undertaking a very significant amount of work. And that, of course, leaves them really overburdened. And the main issue with that is that even if those teams then may be able to put the assessment in place, conduct the assessment, but there is then no more space, capacity, time, or bandwidth left to engage actively with the use of learning data and to assist the different users of these data in the past. So capacities are definitely, these technical capacities are definitely at the heart of our conversation today. And one of the important recommendations that are coming out of this research study, and then we will go back to them later, is that, of course, national and international partners need to focus on the capacity development. And participation in cross-national assessments may be one of the ways to do it. It's definitely not the only one, but this is one of the ways that some countries use. So let us now move to the next slide and look at another important factor that we analyze, which is dissemination of assessment results. So I think that this is one of the most often discussed barriers in the literature and in general. But so what did we learn about it? Because I still feel that our study also brought interesting nuances to these questions. So first of all, we've seen that very rarely were dissemination modalities clearly and strategically defined well in advance. And so this often led to situations where dissemination activities were quite ad hoc and maybe poorly coordinated, which of course negatively affected the use of learning data. This was not always the case. There was a very interesting example of Namibia that provided very specific guidelines to actors across the education system of how and when learning data are supposed to be disseminated and shared with different actors. So that was a very interesting, good practice that we've also noticed. Another element that the study highlighted was linked to the informal channels of communication that tried to a certain way substitute formal, but maybe sometimes less functioning channels. And in some countries, this proved to be a very good practice because people could access the data when they needed. However, people that remained outside of this informal information circle couldn't access that information. That was definitely a downside of this strategy. So we've really seen that both informal and formal information sharing channels should be strengthened. Another element also that the study demonstrated is that very often dissemination products are quite narrow in range. So very often we would see an assessment report and a dissemination meeting, but very rarely we saw something going beyond that. And the literature also very clearly indicates that a number of different types of dissemination products are really necessary to reach different types of audiences. Another important aspect was that we really saw this interruption of the information flow when it came to decentralized level, whereas central level actors more often had access to learning assessment data. Very often we could see that decentralized level officials more rarely receive that information. So that was also very important. And finally, of course, the issue of timeliness was at the heart of all of our discussions. So we've seen situations when learning data arrive just after all the planning processes, annual planning processes are finalized. For instance, this was the case in Namibia. And actors then are tempted either to use the old data or rely on examination results that are also good, which is also a good source of information, but it provides a slightly different type of information. We've also seen that sometimes even large-scale assessments, the ones that are conducted internationally, also arrive quite late. And then, well, timeliness really becomes key because data users cannot really rely anymore on this information. So adjusting the planning and data production cycles are definitely very important. And finally, we've also seen that, unfortunately, dissemination is one of the most often financially cut areas that we've seen. That means that if there are some cuts that need to be done, very often, unfortunately, it touches up on dissemination, which also negatively affects the use of learning data. So we'll have now two polling questions here. So because we also want to hear from you and from your experience. So I will pass the floor back to Amaranta to introduce the two questions.
Merci beaucoup, Yeva. Très bien, je vais partager mon écran.
Thank you very much, Yeva. Let me share my screen. You have the instructions in the chat box. We will once again use Mentimeter. Okay, I hope you can all see my screen. I will share the instructions again on the screen again. So go to menti.com and enter the code 38251427. I repeat, menti.com. Code to enter 38251427. You also have a QR code which you can scan directly with your cellular phone. I just leave the instructions a few seconds on the screen, but otherwise you can find these instructions in the chat box, menti.com, and the code is 38251427. If you have a problem, please let us know. If you have any problem to join menti.com, let us know. Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to question number 2. Do you think you receive assessment results soon enough for your activities? And we can see that we have 99 answers on the screen. Most people said no. I just leave the results a few seconds on the screen so that you can continue to respond. Do you think you receive the assessment results soon enough for your activities? 131 people have answered. Lieva, would you like to say anything?
Thank you so much, Miranda. So I think that, this trend definitely is in line with what we've been saying, and that only shows that timeliness remains a very important issue, and especially when it comes to data, because we know that planners and policymakers really need up-to-date information on their student results in order to make decisions. And the information that comes later, when those processes are already finalized, definitely is losing their momentum. So once again, thank you so much for your responses. And we can clearly see that this remains an important issue. So let's now go to another question that links to dissemination.
Tout à fait. Merci beaucoup, Yeva.
Yes, thank you very much, Leva. What type of dissemination products of the assessment results would you find the most useful? You can choose up to 3 possibilities. So we're starting to get the first responses. You can see them on the screen. I'll just give you a few more seconds and leave the question on the screen. What type of dissemination products of assessment results would you find the most useful? Choose up to 3 options. So 65 people have already answered. Great. Thank you very much to all of you. To all of you who've answered the question, Lieva, would you like to make a comment? We have 116 people who have responded so far.
Yes, thank you so much, Amaranta, once again. And yes, we can see that definitely the outputs that summarize the results and bring the most important findings to readers seem to be very important. So we see summary report and policy briefs that got a lot of votes, and definitely these documents are important because we know that we only have a very limited time that we can spend with different sources of data, and that they need to come, handy. But I'm also really happy to see that the technical report, this longer and more in-depth analysis, appears also to be important. And I think this also illustrates very well, the point that we've been making in the book, that both types and different types of dissemination means are very important, because we need to be able to access this more synthesized elements. But for those who need it and the ones that want to go back into these technical elements, there should be a technical report available that also explains all the methodology used and more technical and presents more technical details. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I think we can resume the presentation now. Yes. Can you see my screen? I'm not sure if I managed to share it. 1 second. Okay. Okay. Yes. So let us now move to the next slide, and we'll now look at the role of the different actors, and more specifically at the political economy of actors that was so important in this research study. So right from the beginning, we had this very strong assumption that people, their dynamics, the power balance that there may be among them, are actually very important elements that may affect the use of learning assessment data and that are often overlooked. And so our assumption was right, and we've seen just how important different actors are in these processes. So let's start with international partners that were also at the heart of our study. So in all the countries that we worked in, we saw that they played a very important role in national assessment systems. So very often they provided technical and financial support to the development of these assessments. They supported the introduction of assessments in other ways as well. And finally, they were important advocates for the use of assessment data in different ways. So we've seen in our research that these different collaboration modalities did not have the same effect. So in some contexts, this created mutually beneficial relationships that strengthened national assessment systems. However, in other cases, we've seen that these efforts actually undermined the national autonomy and ownership of learning assessment data and led to power misbalance that negatively affected national assessment systems, but more specifically the use of their data, as learning assessments were more often understood as something external or more linked to a procedure. So let us now look more closely at these two types of balance, the more complex one and the more positive one. So let's start with the one where we've seen some misbalance between national and international actors and what contributed to this situation. So first of all, of course, the available budget for assessments always played a very important role because when assessments largely depend on external funding, national authorities have a less oversight and less ownership of these assessments. So in some cases, this led to assessment discontinuity, or in some other cases, this led to a very strong partner's influence on assessment modalities that were not always in line with actually the needs and the priorities of the ministries themselves. We've also seen that in some cases, this led to overlap and duplication of programs when they were responding directly to the partner's needs. Another important element, and we've discussed this already, was the lack of national technical capacity. So definitely when national capacities are low, the participation and support of international partners sometimes led to the outsourcing of certain assessment activities. And whereas in some cases it was indeed important to ensure validity and reliability of this analysis, it also led to issues of transparency and access to data. And most importantly, it really disrupted a national data management cycle when, in some cases, data was outsourced to external specialists or even outsourced to another country, which definitely hindered this link and engagement the national authorities had with the learning data. And finally, poor coordination among national actors and issues that may have hindered their leadership were also important. So in contexts where we saw the competition among different teams in charge of assessments or distrust the national assessment team's capacities were definitely negatively affecting the whole equilibrium, because when there was no national leadership emerging, the whole balance was not there. So a set of these different these elements led to decreased national autonomy in assessment management, lack of country ownership, and a result, a more limited use of assessment data. But it's important to notice that we've also seen some positive examples and some really positive and mutually beneficial relationships. And once again, well, in these situations, political leadership played a very important role, and especially considering the internal push to develop the system and focus on capacity. So the Gambia was a great example where there was really a high-level political commitment to develop capacities nationally, to avoid outsourcing at all costs, and this indeed had positive results. We've also seen that this positive power balance was often more present in countries where there was involvement of national actors in the management of learning data, and when learning assessments were aligned with other education systems' priorities. So there may have been one or two countries that more clearly fit in one or the other power balance, but it's true that many are situated in the continuum, kind of mixing elements from both of these sides. So let us now look at the national actors. First, the dynamics among actors at central level, and then we'll look at decentralized level actors. So what we've seen that these different exchanges and dynamics among actors at central level also had a big influence on the use of learning assessment data. So we've seen that some of the units were working in silos that definitely, to a certain extent, limited then the use of learning data. And this issue is not necessarily only valid for learning when we speak about learning assessments, as it may be also a more general issue that we observed. Another important element was that information sometimes was not information sharing was not necessarily institutionalized or not implemented according to existing frameworks, which left certain actors out of these discussions. And another element that links also directly to this is that some actors sometimes feel excluded from the assessment management. And while to a certain extent it can be understood because these are highly technical exercises and assessment teams need to keep their impartiality in the process, it's very important to really strike this balance between reserving the work for technicians that needs to be done, but also being inclusive throughout the different processes. And finally, we've also seen a lack of meaningful dialogue on learning assessments. So whereas there would be a report or a meeting organized to discuss learning results, actors were often emphasizing that, okay, but what's next? There was a lack of this critical discussion on, okay, so what can we do now based on these results? What would be the next step? How can we look at a different data source and, make sense out of it? So that was also an important finding. And we wanted to look for deeper causes that could account for this often poor collaboration. And once again, this was not necessarily the case in all countries that we worked in. So we've seen that this culture, kind of unwritten culture in the ministries of education, played an important role. So in some cases, we've seen this open door culture when people would just very easily contact each other, knock on each other's doors, exchange WhatsApp messages, asking where is the data, when can I access it? And everyone was trying to really work together to share the data, which of course facilitated its use. But we've also seen situations where there was very strong competition between different units involved in assessment management. And in some cases, yes, people would say that, well, data is power, and sharing that data may also have certain power implications. So it was really interesting to see these different cultures and, of course, how it then influenced the use of learning data. And finally, this never-ending, division between technicians and policymakers that IEP has also illustrated in the past already with other research works, ensuring that, that there is this dialogue between the two, because, of course, assessment technicians and policymakers have very different agendas and goals, but it's definitely key to work together in order to make the best use of learning assessment data. So let us now look at the dynamics that existed between central and decentralized levels, because that was also an important question that we analyzed in the research. So we've seen that whereas decentralized level officials very often play a very important role to gather the data and then to send it up to the higher level, there was very often a lack of effective feedback loop that would then feed back into these lower administrative levels. And then there was, of course, these negative feelings that remain with decentralized level officials, as they work really hard to contribute to that, but they do not get any feedback after all. We've also seen in some cases that there has been quite a top-down nature of this relationship, which is not only the case, of course, when we speak about learning data, but that it manifested there as well. And that there may sometimes be some sort of a blame game regarding the results or even the process of collecting the data. And that decentralized level was really the area where more support is needed for them to fully also reap the benefits of learning assessment. And here is our last polling question about this dynamic and whether you've also seen something similar in your experience. So I will now give the floor back to Amaranta for this.
Merci beaucoup, Yeva.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yeva. You have the instructions in the chat box. I will now be sharing my screen for this last poll question.
Super.
Great. So here you have the question on my screen, but I will first share the instructions once again. So go to menti.com and enter the code 38251427. I repeat, go to menti.com and enter the code 38251427. Or if you prefer, you can also scan the QR code on my screen with your cellular phone. So I leave the information a few seconds on the screen so that you can connect them. You have the instructions in the chat box anyhow, and the instructions explain how to access. So once again, I repeat, go to menti.com and enter the code 38251427. Great. So let's move on to the question now. To what extent do you agree that learning assessments are managed with a top-down approach in your country? And we start seeing answers. Thank you to all of you who take the time to answer these questions. We have 115 answers so far. I don't know, Lieva, whether you would like to start commenting.
Yes, thank you so much, Amaranta. And yeah, I think that the trend is very clear, and that's very much in line with our research findings, because we see that the majority of participants, responded that they agree or even strongly agree with the fact, and that definitely further illustrates this this top-down approach, and also, you know, the kind of tensions that this may create, as we've just analyzed. So I think that very, very strongly supports also this argument. Thank you so much, Amaranta, and thank you so much for all of your responses. And I think we can continue with the very last bit of the presentation. Yes. So just to finish this discussion about the central and decentralized level and the way they use learning data. So as we've mentioned, decentralized level officials play a very important role in administering assessments, sending the completed test stacks and reporting on learning performance based on data, and central level also assist them to a certain extent. But we've also seen that there has been a lack of feedback on assessment results, and then lack of support for the use of assessment data. And also, if we expect a decentralized level further supports schools in the use of this data, then they themselves also need greater need for capacity development. And just one very important final thought here is that, as one of our respondents was saying, that it is really important to do some deep research behind and ask questions. Are schools really using it? Are different actors actually in the system really using it? Because even if we make this further step and we work to improve the use of learning data, it is important to look, is it actually working? And where are different actors with regards to this issue? So let us now move to the last slide with some final list of reflections and quite of a summary of our discussion today, but also our research results. So a couple of thoughts for different actors that we worked with throughout this research project. So first of all, it's very important that the Ministry of Education leadership plays this active role in clearly defining the goals of assessments. Because it definitely helps to be more strategic, to use limited financial resources in the best way, and also to ensure that there is no overlap across different assessments and that they are actually built in the way to complement each other. It's also important to gear the system towards national leadership and ownership. And really, we've seen that if national actors do not feel that they own the data, that they are active players in these processes, they do not have interest to use that data in their everyday activities. So that's definitely a very important element. It's also key to plan for the use of data when developing assessments. Sometimes, we may be tempted to think, oh, this will come later. Let's first set the assessment. But actually, this thinking about the use of data really needs to happen very early on, because it will then also shape the way assessments are created, the way they are designed, and even the types of questions that will be asked in them. And finally, it's really important to commit to the development of national capacities in the production and use of learning data, and this at different administrative levels. Because without these capacities to either produce or use, all the other elements would not be working either. So we also had a couple of thoughts for the national assessment teams that, of course, are at the heart of all of these discussions. It's important that they also facilitate the understanding of learning data for different actors by adapting dissemination products and their content. So they definitely need to play this link between the data that they are collecting, that they are analyzing, and what actors can actually make out of it. It's also important that reporting is not the end of an assessment cycle. Just putting results out there is not enough, because there needs to be this constructive feedback loop and maybe other actors that can take on this element, but in order to make sure that there is a critical reflection, there is an action that then follows these results. As we've seen, it's also really crucial to involve other actors in the management of assessments, and there is always these tensions between technicality and impartiality, but also the inclusiveness. But if we want different actors in the system to actually use the data, it is important for them to be at the table when different decisions are being made. We also want to look for synergies with other information sources, especially examinations. We've not touched upon that a lot today, but it's true that examinations, as well as different types of assessments, can really provide this complementary information, and combining them is really a true strength that can give us a full picture. So no one assessment would ever provide us with all the information that we need. But if we use it in collaboration with all the other elements, that would be really, really helpful. And finally, it's also important to adjust assessment cycles to regular planning and budgeting activities, because every country may have their own cycle, their planning or policy cycle. And it's important to ensure that learning data really come in those key moments. And finally, a couple of thoughts also for international partners that have played a very important role in all these processes is that, first of all, it's key to invest in capacities and transfer expertise and discourage outsourcing as much as possible. It's also important to ensure that the support that is provided to learning assessments is in line with priorities defined in education sector plans and other strategic documents. And finally, it is key to rely as much as possible on existing national assessments rather than creating new ones, because creating new assessments without very strong rationale may lead to this constellation of overlapping assessments that are also using the limited financial and especially human resources that exist. So I will stop here. Thank you so much for your attention. And I think that we could now move to the open discussion questions, because I've seen that, there were quite some questions coming in. So I think, we have quite some time for a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Eva, for this very interesting, rich, and very relevant presentation about the key factors. Even though I'm working in this area since 1999, it reminds me a lot of factors, for example, turnover and so on. Yes, we have a lot of questions. Just to respond some common question from the chat. Yes, the link, this webinar is recorded in French and English, and the links will be shared with you, as well as a PowerPoint presentation. So don't worry. As well, the link to the IEP webpage about this research program will be also shared. It's also shared in the chat screen. Sorry. Maybe let's start with the first question, Eva, from Yves Ashdar. Why is the focus on data use of large-scale international regional assessments rather than national assessment data? Is it because large-scale international assessments are more rigorously developed and recognized? So this is the first question for you, Eva.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, that is indeed a very good question. Just to emphasize that really throughout this research project, we were looking very equally at both international and national large-scale assessments. Some countries, for instance, didn't even have an international or regional assessment, and so we were really looking at them simultaneously. And I wouldn't say that they had more. As you say, maybe more reputation. Maybe this comes more from the global debate, but definitely from what we've seen in the research is that both are very important. They have sometimes different functions and different goals. Whereas an international assessment can allow you to compare your education system to other countries, the national assessments can provide much more specific information that is needed to the Ministry of Education and planners, and can also inform schools. So definitely I would see them much more as complementary and providing complementary information, but not saying that one is more important than the other. And actually, I feel that it's actually national large-scale assessments that have much more potential to inform national policy and planning processes, much more than an international that is conducted at a higher level.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Je vais parler en français. Car il y avait
I'm
une autre
going to speak in French because there was another question here. There was this pandemic since 2020, and we would like to know, in regard to your experience, have you seen innovative approaches in ways to publish results, the products of these national evaluations? I'm asking this because with the pandemic, you had to be creative. You had to look for other ways to publish results. Like this webinar, for instance, is one way of disseminating our research results, communicating with our audience, with different stakeholders. So I was wondering, have you observed, I know it's a two-part question, have you seen any innovative approaches after the pandemic come up, and perhaps an example of the best practices in terms of disseminating results, really as actors of, as the stakeholders of education? Thank you.
Yes, so thank you so much for that. So as I've mentioned, all the data for this research project was conducted actually before March 2020. So the last data that came in was exactly March 2020, just before the pandemic started. So this research project has not allowed to gather any information about how data may be shared or disseminated during the pandemic. What we know is that some assessments were not conducted during the pandemic period. Some assessments were delayed and had to resume the data collection when the sanitary situation improved. So that was important. But if we go back to these best practices of how to share and diffuse data that actually our research spoke to, I think a very interesting example that is also documented in the book was the Gambia school cards, where in a very creative way they would present the results of the school, but also the resources of the school, as well as how that school compares to other schools in the district or the region. And that was communicated at the school level, which also allowed this national large-scale assessment results to be used for a very specific school planning exercise. That was a very direct use, and that school level actors could actually really reap the benefits of the richness of this data.
Okay, thank you, Eva. Yes, you mentioned one more time Gambia, so I really recommend the participant to read the book. Well, we cannot see really. It is now available in French. It was launched in English 6 months ago, which this is give a synthesis of your work conducted in those 6 countries. So if you would like to have further information. We have a lot of questions, Eva, but maybe we don't have time to respond to all of them. Maybe we need one day. So there was one question about, have you seen any linkages between the IEPS and the data on learning assessment, whether there was some communication between those 2 units?
Could you just please repeat which units?
EMIS, Educational Management Information System, that used to collect annual school census data.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a very interesting question, because in general, maybe you can confirm these 2 units. One who collect annual school census data every year, and in general, there is another unit about assessments, student assessments. And it's very rare to see any communication between those 2. And in fact, they work in the same area, producing data to get policy. So have you seen in your research conducted in sub-Saharan countries any relationship, communication between those 2 units, or best practice according to that?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sorry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for this question as well. And it's true that we looked at this link. I think there's even like a very small chapter about that. And yes, we've seen that unfortunately these different data sets are very often not linked to one another. The information, even from national large-scale assessments, are very often not linked to the information that is in IEPS, but actually this is where I think a real potential lies, because if we were able to link both data sets, then we could really have much more information about what influences learning, and we could really unpack much more what are the main factors affecting learning, and that would be such an important information for policy making. So of course there are these issues of certain assessments being sample and some assessments being census, and different other issues to link them. But there have been a couple of countries that we worked in that we're really thinking about that, and we're trying to find a way to link the different data sets, and therefore to link different teams so that they can better work together. But yeah, unfortunately, we've also seen in other countries that these were quite separate units that seem to be not necessarily working together on certain elements, but definitely a very important fact. And I just wanted to quickly mention, as I have the floor, that if you're really interested in more to know more about these different elements, there's another webinar series, 3-part webinar series that we released some time ago, and that really unpacked these different themes. And that all the information that we've published, it's also available by country. So if you're joining us from one of the project countries, then it may also be interesting for you to read those specific country.
Thank you, Eva. Yes, just to reflect a little bit about what you said, and as I'm working also on UMIS, it's true that with national, regional, or international assessment studies, we can collect a lot of information about students that can explain. It's not a question about measuring the level of knowledge or the skills of the students and teachers sometimes, but how can we explain that with other factors? And it's true that with EMIS, it's not really the same kind of data that are collected. It's not to have such detailed data. And that's why, but it can be complementary. There was a lot of questions about why we are not using, in your research, you are not mentioning examinations. Why you focus only on learning assessment data? Maybe if I just can say something about that, because it's also one point of the course that I'm coordinated on. The purpose of examination is different than assessment studies. Examinations, if I'm not wrong, Eva, you can correct me. Examination, the main purpose is to evaluate individuals and to give a certification or not to an individual. But learning assessment studies, the purpose is really about the system assessment. It's not to look at one individual. It's to look whether, what is the level at that moment, the level of achievement, for example, of the students at primary, secondary, whatever the level, what is the picture at that moment. So which is different from examinations. And I think maybe that's why for your study, Eva, you focus more on those kind of learning assessment data, because it's not focused on individuals and certification.
Yes, you are completely right. And it's true that we get this question a lot. And we really wanted to look at those assessments that are more diagnostic in nature and that are meant to inform policy and planning. But having said that, it's true that examinations really, in many cases, they are still used as the only reliable information about learning results, because whereas these large-scale assessments sometimes are not conducted, sometimes due to financial or other issues, examinations take place every year. And so very often, especially if we need timely data, they are the only source that is available for us to have an understanding of where our students are. So definitely this remains a very important source of information. And I guess the goal is to see how this can work together with these large-scale assessments and what kind of complementary information we can get from both.
Okay, thank you. We are receiving a lot of questions here. Another question is about a journalist. How can we diffuse okay, we talk a lot about processes, factors within the ministry, but maybe one who can put a lot of pressure and release data and release information can come from the journalist. Have you seen any results from that, from the 6 countries where you have been doing this research, whether they work with the ministry, whether they can also encourage, motivate this use of data, and for everybody to be aware about that, not only for practitioners, for educational, but also for the one who are at school, the students, the parents, and so on.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And, when we started this research project, we definitely thought about the role of the media and what we already knew in the literature about the media. So that's definitely very relevant. So we've not analyzed the role of the media per se in this research project. But yeah, what we've seen when we were conducting this literature review is that, well, media can play a very important role to create this shock effect, meaning not necessarily providing a very detailed and nuanced analysis, but really creating this urge and this push that, something needs to change because the results are really bad. So what they do, what it often has done in the past is exactly create this shock effect, this push to look then more attentively. And this can indeed be positive. However, I think that the important element to mention is that, of course, there is a bit of this sensationalization of what's in the media, this excitement effect, but that can really prevent us from seeing the nuanced results and the nuanced stories. So it can provide a first good push to pay attention to this issue, but then I guess it's important to go back to these technical or summary reports to really see, what's happening, what has changed in the past, what are the factors contributing to that. And yes, as you've mentioned, Stephanie, these assessments collect very rich information also on different student, teacher, school characteristics, and that can really be used in so many different ways.
Thank you so much, Eva. It remember me when I'm based in France, and when I heard something in the news saying the quality is very bad in France, I'm very shocked. And it's true that my second reaction is to look at the technical report. I tried to find those technical reports in the French Ministry of Education website. Yes, we are receiving a lot of questions. Maybe last one or two last one. It's about what can we do when there's a lack of budget resources. What can we do?
Yeah, that's a very, very big question, and I'm not sure if I'm in the capacity actually to respond to this, but as I've mentioned during the presentation, the discontinuity of assessment definitely has negative repercussions on the use of learning data. So as much as possible, this reliable funding is important. But then, as you say, what do we do when there is a lack of budget? So there are different ways to play to a certain way with assessment modalities. So for instance, choosing a sample-based assessment could help reduce the costs over a census-based assessment, but it's also important to find this balance in those choices, because for instance, in some countries, we've heard very clearly that we don't want a sample-based assessment. We want to evaluate all of our students, and we'll do what it takes to get the money for that. So it's really finding the balance. But so one of the things is to work on the assessment modalities.
Yes, maybe the question for you was not only for you, but for all the education community.
Yeah, that's a very, very big one indeed.
With limited resource, yes, we need to be more creative. First, maybe we need to be aware about those factors. And in fact, when I listened to you, Eva, I was thinking, how can I use what you said for my own country? And maybe is to do a diagnosis on the factors that you raise. What are the factors that can affect the use of this data in my country, such as a diagnostic one? So we are almost at the end of this webinar, but maybe a last question, Eva? Do you agree? Yes.
Yes, sure.
It's about, lack of country ownership.
Mm-hmm.
Something that we raised this question. Peut-être je vais parler en français, car on m'a dit que je parlais un peu trop l'anglais.
Maybe I should speak French, because I was told that I use English too much. One thing which is really important is is country's ownership. When you have activities being carried out, particularly when it comes to the assessment of learning assessments, we know that it is important to strengthen or to build capacities, and the decisions to participate in these large studies is an appropriate way of developing and strengthening and building national capacities. Is it one of the means? Are there other possibilities? Are there more ways and means to build the national capacities? Not only to carry out these studies and surveys, but also to use the data.
Thank you so much. This is indeed a very important question, because we've seen also during the presentation this link between the ownership and capacities, and that of course you need a certain level of capacities to have the ownership of your assessment system. And as we discussed, participation in these large-scale assessments is one of the ways to develop those capacities, and it could be a good option. However, it's also important to understand that there is always this opportunity cost, because we've also seen when countries are involved in even multiple regional or international assessments that requires a lot of their human resources. And we've discussed about the scarcity of these skill sets and a scarcity of these professionals in these systems that may then be, kind of towards these large and regional scale assessments, and the national one can actually suffer from that. So I guess, yes, it is one way. Again, it's not the only way. There are other ways to develop those competencies, and I think it is also important. Well, first of all, to set the goals for your assessment system and to see what you actually want to achieve with it. But then, if informing a national policy by national assessment is an important goal in your system, then it's important to strike this balance, I guess, between the two.
Merci beaucoup, Eva. Nous allons conclure.
Thank you very much, Eva. We're now going to conclude this very interesting and fruitful seminar. I don't know whether you have one last comment you would like to make or say something, or should I conclude?
Yeah, very quickly. Thank you so much for all of your time. I'm really happy to see that so many people joined these discussions and that so many people are interested in these conversations. So yeah, just thank you so much for your time.
Merci beaucoup, Eva.
Thank you very much, Eva.
Beatrice would like to say a final word before I close this webinar.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Eva. This has been really rich, and I think the bilingual aspect of it is also quite an added value from us that we try to, cater. We had 60% English speakers and 40% French speakers, so we were trying to cater to you. And we have all the presentations in both languages and the translation. But I just wanted to really thank Eva and thank Stephanie. As I said before, this is part of the course that we offer. So we have a group of 37 participants following this course for 6 weeks. They will get an IEP certificate at the end of the course with demonstrating their skills in understanding the use of student assessment surveys for measuring SDG for progress. And this is, as I said at the beginning, one of our courses. We have many like this. And I also want to take the opportunity because, as I said before, it is very much focused on us at IIP helping learners learn how to have stronger capacity to lead and manage education systems. And we have a lot of people behind the scene as well. You see Laura Paviot, Yonju, Anne, Amaranta, and the interpreters in addition. So you can't see their faces, but they're there supporting you, our participants, to make sure that things run smoothly. And so I wanted to thank them as well, and the interpreters. I'm very proud of the team. I think that they're doing a great job, and we're always looking to improve. So we continue providing you opportunities for learning. So thank you very much, everybody. And I will let Stephanie the final word to close this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beatrice. I will close this webinar in French. Je vais fermer ce webinaire, même si j'ai pas envie de fermer.
I will close this webinar in French, even though I don't feel like closing this webinar. I feel like continuing. Thank you, Lieva. It's always a pleasure to have you and to work with you. Once again, I would like to remind the participants that there were 350 participants today, which is great. Thank you so much for all the interest in the work we do, and thank you also for the importance for this topic. And I would like to tell you that this Lieva's presentation will be posted both in French and in English. In the chat box, you have the specialized course and the research program of Lieva. It's a detailed. You have all the details that Lieva mentioned, and you have also the learning portal of the IIEP, because there is a portal dealing with this topic. One last point, I also would like to thank all the IIEP team. It's always a great pleasure to work with the team. It's very professional, very pleasant. pleasant. And thank all our participants who were with us this morning. In a few days from now, you will be receiving a link regarding the satisfaction survey, because it's very important for us to have your feedback and know what you thought about it. It's an anonymous questionnaire, so please fill it in and send it back. I wish you a very nice day and nice continuation. I continue my online course another 4 weeks, and the participants, and I saw in the chat box that they were with us today. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lieva. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you to the IEP team, all the IEP team and our interpreters. Thank you, goodbye, and have a nice day.
Bye. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to having you in our future courses, such as the crisis sensitive planning that is coming up. Look in our website, and thank you very much again.
Merci beaucoup. Merci, au revoir.
Thank you, Eva.